Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. This time, we'll call it the Australia edition. Remember to support the podcast. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month. And we do private weekly group Zoom chats with subscribers to shoot the breeze on current events. And I do a weekly write-up of the most important news of the week and my commentary. You can also donate through Wise, Donor Box, and other options are available on the website. Purchase a consult if you want to chat with me, and do check out all of my affiliates. Leave a podcast review on Apple, Spotify, and elsewhere if you have not. Just take a few minutes out of your day. That's a big help for Geopolitics and Empire. And joining us for the first time is Michael Arbon, who's an advisor to Australian Senator Ralph Babet in Victoria of the United Australia Party. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me. Khavoya, is that how I say your name? We're not very good at rolling out R's in Australia.
You're not. You got it. But you've got a lot of Croats in Australia. You know, there's this old joke someone told me some years back when in the World Cup, when Australia plays Croatia, it's like Croatia playing itself. Maybe the demographics there have changed over the years. But, I found you somewhere on social media. I like the work that you're doing. We're on the same frequency. And, it's nice to get an update from Australia once in a while. Maybe to start real quick, as I understand it, you're a family man, you're a businessman, you're involved in politics now. If you could just tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a husband and a father first. I've got 3 young kids and I live in the beautiful Adelaide Hills in South Australia. I grew up in the country on a wheat, barley and sheep farm, so a very Australian upbringing, very free, no distractions from this world. I spent my time as a child playing outside, working on the farm and living the simple life, which was great. And now sort of raising my own children and understanding the way the world's going, I've been running my own business for about 10 or 11 years now in finance. And in 2020, you may have noticed that Australia became a little bit of an authoritarian nightmare. And in 2022, I decided it was the time to have a crack at politics. So I ran for the Senate myself in South Australia. I fell short on that run, but Senator Babet got elected and we got to know each other during that period quite well. And since he was elected, I've become an advisor to him. So I'm now one of those that works in politics, unfortunately, but it's a necessary evil. So I do my best that I can to support him. Senator Babet's probably the Australian senator who's expanding that Overton window the most in Australia. He's really challenging the narrative of the major parties. And much like America, you find that when you get a two-party system, the two parties generally become quite close around the middle. The conservative or the libertarian values sort of get put to the side for the Conservative Party. They don't hold true to them all the time. So Senator Babet and our team are doing the best we can to sort of nudge politics back in the direction where it should be, where politicians stay out of our lives and they don't influence everything that we do, because we don't need politicians involved in everything we do in life. We believe in the individual and the rights of the individual to live their life how they wish.
Yeah, and I've seen the speeches that Ralph has given, and I'll stand behind him. And even though I'm a Croatian American in Mexico, I think it's important to help amplify the work that you're doing and the senator. And if that helps amplify your work, great. And I've had on the podcast folks like, I think it was back in 2020, Australia One's Ricardo Bossi. In 2021, I had Senator Malcolm Roberts on, whose work I very much appreciate as well. And I like to say I've worked myself. Technically, I've worked for Australian media with TNT radio, and so I got a bit of a connection with Australia. Never been there, maybe someday. But what you mentioned after the 2020s, that actually makes me not want to visit places like Australia or Canada. And maybe to get your thoughts on the state of freedom in Australia, there's a number of concerns I have, but what are some of the biggest issues in your mind?
If you look out the window every day, it still looks like a free country. Australia doesn't look like an authoritarian state right now. If you rewind the clock 2.5 years, it did. There was segregation and people were locked down, and people were locked out of their jobs because they wouldn't take a vaccine, or out of school, and all sorts of things. So we have just come out of what was a very sort of authoritarian period. But what I see government doing now is they're legislating a whole bunch of things, including digital ID and misinformation bills and truth in political advertising, whatever that is. They're legislating a whole bunch of things that don't really affect people today or tomorrow, but they're the kind of bills that in 5 or 10 years' time, if you did have the wrong leader or the wrong government in power, there is so much power being centralized that they could really silence a lot of debate and silence a lot of opinion and almost lock a certain narrative out of the public discourse. And then, you've got other mechanisms whereby we are trialing a central bank digital currency. It's not rolled out yet, but that's being trialed. So there are all sorts of things happening behind the scenes that one day could empower an authoritarian to really destroy what the West stands for.
And I mean, just to go a bit further on that note, this has been one of my obsessions on the podcast. One of them being the advance of globalism, world government. They talk about that a lot, but also algorithm ghetto. And I'm trying to make that phrase popular because in May of 2020, I asked renowned Jewish historian Edwin Black to come on the podcast, and that's his term. He calls it the algorithm ghetto. In China, they call it the social credit system. In Russia, they call it the electronic concentration camp or cyber gulag. And it seems this system is just spreading globally. It's here in Mexico, right? We're just a month ago, Mexican papers, mainstream papers said we're going to divide Mexico City into multiple 15-minute cities. Other mayors are jumping on that. They're promoting openly with glee. Mexican politicians are promoting Agenda 2030 and digital ID and Mexican CBDCs. And so this stuff is pushing forward. And what you mentioned, these bills in Australia, it's like they're bringing into law thought crime. Some of my past podcast guests now are facing jail for a thought crime. I had on an ex-Moldovan politician, Yuri Roshka, who's facing jail time for thought crime. C.J. Hopkins, American in Germany, he's now facing jail time in Germany for comments on social media. And so it's really like 1984 come to life. And just any further thought on if this stuff succeeds, it's what will life look like? I feel like we're going to be living in a science fiction movie, no?
Yeah, so they use a pretty similar tactic for most of this legislation. So one of the things we're seeing at the moment is also the proposal to ban social media for children up to the age of 16. So there would be no social media for children up to 16, which sounds lovely. Like you're protecting children from this big harm of social media, but then you think about it objectively and all of a sudden, what are those children's source of information going to be? It's going to be mainstream media and the government. They will have no ability to source alternative information or challenge the narrative. So the state is really taking over the raising of children in Australia. Like in my state of South Australia as well, we're seeing the age of preschool reduced to 3 years of age now. So really children are in that public schooling system from 3 through to 18 when they finish year 12, but then also university thereafter. And what chance are we giving them to think freely and develop their own minds when really the state is teaching them their narrative from early on? Like I'm very conscious in my house of keeping things simple for our children. We don't have the internet on purpose. We read books and we play outside, and they don't need to have access to connected devices until they're much, much older. I want them to develop as humans and learn some actual real skills and how to talk and how to read before they go into that space. But that's my job as a parent, to control what they have access to, not the state's job. That's overstepping again. And I see that it's sort of, they always use children and protecting children as a way to then implement a larger system over time.
Yeah, I mean, with many other topics, that they always say it's for your benefit, and then they slip in tyranny. And I listened the other day to a great speech by Senator Babet at some events, and speaking of children, one of the topics that he was discussing was this culture war, transgenderism, LGBTQ plus to infinity, as I like to call it, this shoving of liberal globalism down our throats. And I mean, it's crazy, and it's spreading beyond just the West. I'm seeing it come here into Mexico. I mean, I'll go to a Walmart in Mexico with my kid, and they've got Kleenex tissues with rainbow flags that my kid picks up, and I immediately put back down. Or Mickey Mouse puzzles, where it's Disney Mickey Mouse. I've seen this last year here in Mexico, where it's got the rainbow flag on it, and it's actually got a description describing how they're promoting LGBTQ ideology for my children, and this is crazy. And so your thoughts on the culture war, particularly how that's advancing in Australia?
Yeah, I'm a Christian, so the culture war is alive and well for me. We're living in sort of a post-Christendom era where Judeo-Christian values used to be the basis of Western democracy, but now they seem to be the devil. Right's called wrong and wrong's called right. And if you're a conservative Christian with traditional values, you're a dinosaur apparently. And, there is no truth anymore. You can be whatever you want to be, but that's not true either. Like, I think people are starting to see through it actually. There is objective truth. There is right and wrong, and we all have a conscience, and we know that certain things are correct and certain things aren't. And you can confuse kids all you like, but the sky is blue. There are certain objective truths. There is male and female. That is true, and we are made differently for a certain reason. And I guess this links back into the misinformation, disinformation bill. And well, the government put into that bill a definition of serious harm, and that definition is probably the most concerning part of that bill, because now the government is seeking to define and enforce what is harmful and then to silence that. And it included such things as harm to public health and preventative health measures. And when they say preventative health measures, they're not talking about vitamin D and eating a healthy diet. They're talking about pharmaceuticals there. It's obvious. And they're also vilification of a group on the basis of race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, blah, blah, blah. Like everything under the sun. So, what they're doing here is they're saying, sexual orientation. That's something that really concerns me, is if we're teaching children that there are more than two genders, we're replacing those genders with sexual fetishes, really. Let's face it. Like, your sexual preference is now your entire identity. It's a pretty sad world, isn't it? When we're identifying as a sexual preference, not as based on the content of our character.
I mean, just my quick reaction just my quick reading of history. For thousands of years, what one did in their private bedroom space was nobody's business. It's kind of, lately I've been using the term uncouth. That's not, we should know, we should just be like, school should be writing, reading, arithmetic, their personal preferences. Nobody's business. It should not be aired out in public. And it's crazy how we've gotten to this point. And I did want to ask you, I follow what's going on in Australia. Sometimes I appear. I was on Alexandra Marshall's Australia, was it ADH TV? I forget what that exactly stands
Ellie
for.
Melly, she's fantastic. Yes.
Yeah, and so sometimes I make an appearance there, and I follow what's going on in Australia, because I think it's what do you call it, the canary in the coal mine in some instances. And I look at the faces of your legislators, your politicians. I'm not the bad ones, not the Malcolm Roberts and the Babbitts and the others, but these people passing these bills of misinformation, the thought crime legislation, the digital ID, and resilient smart cities. And I wonder, what is going through the minds of these liberal globalist apparatchiks? These Australian politicians, who for me are like zombie Borg bots who, without flinching, just suggest and pass totalitarian legislation after legislation. Is like, I mean, what do they think? Don't they have kids? Don't they have grandkids? Maybe they have the money, they're getting paid now, and the status, but I hope they'll come to regret what they're passing. Just your thoughts on these the types of politicians in Australia, which I assume are the vast majority. No.
Yeah, it is the vast majority. So, the good senators I can count on one hand probably, and the rest are of the ilk that you're talking about. And, I think about this a lot. What drives these people? Why do they have such a different worldview to what we have? We just have a worldview where, the government should get out of people's lives and let them live the best life they possibly can and make their own choices. But they seem to want to control everything. And I think this is a symptom of what's emerged in Australia over the past probably 4 or 5 decades, which is the career politician. A lot of these people went to university and studied arts and political science or law, and then they went straight into a role as a political advisor, having not had a real job, having not created any wealth or any jobs in the real world, or even taking any significant risks. So the only world they know is a world whereby government fixes all of the people's problems. And all I ever see government do is actually amplify and make people's problems worse, personally. But they believe that they can solve the world's problems, and they don't have a new idea in their head. Their ideas are not coming from their own office or from their own brains. They're coming from the global think tanks, the UNs, the WHOs, the WEFs, because these people also believe in the expertocracy, that there is an expert out there that knows everything about a certain topic and we must follow their advice. And sadly, they believe that the experts lie within these global bodies. But I've stayed up late at night watching these public hearings of the UN, the WHO, and the WEF, and I can tell you they all just repeat the same talking points. And they're largely emotive. They're rarely based in fact. Often it's the Greta Thunberg types, they get to sell their narrative. But the reality is the narrative is nothing but emotion. There's no facts that underlie it, and they don't allow the alternate point of view to have, the light of day. So, I think the career politician element is massive. I'm not sure what it's like around the rest of the world, but these people seem to have wanted to be prime minister from the day they were born, and all they know is public office, but not so much public service. Running for parliament or being a member of parliament or a senator should be a public service. It should be something that you do to give back to society, trying to make it better. And not enough of those people we have elected at the moment seek to make Australia better by getting out of the way of the Australian people. Most of them think that they can fix the problems by being heavily involved in your life every minute of the day.
Yeah, when it comes to politics, I'm greatly disillusioned, but I'm not as black-pilled as some listeners. I still think, some people say, they have like 0% faith in any party or a politician. And while I do empathize with that a lot, I still think, people like Roberts or yourself and Babet should keep doing what you're doing and pushing back. And because folks such as yourselves begrudgingly throw your hat into the arena, as you said, you're a businessman. I think Ralph Babet was involved in real estate previously. And you just, I was thinking over the years when I used to teach at the top university in Mexico, I used to have a large number of international exchange students, and a large portion were Australian students. Who knows, maybe some are listening now, but I recall now, it's interesting that a lot of these Australian exchange students were more dissident thinkers. I remember one of them who walked around campus and around town here in Mexico without any shoes, just completely barefoot. That's been a trend. So maybe they were more the hippie-ish type. But let me ask you just your thoughts on the state of the economy in Australia.
Our housing market is the biggest Ponzi scheme that exists. I know it well from my business, but Australian housing, I think, is the second least affordable in the world. Mortgage debt is essentially a noose around the neck of the Australian people, and it's largely as a result. It's been amplified massively over the past 3 or 4 years, because during the pandemic years, our Reserve Bank provided the banks with so much capital that they were overcapitalized and they just could not give enough money away. And then we see our house prices jump in some cities 50% over a few years. What that means is that the average Australian, like in my home state here in South Australia, has to borrow more than 9.5 times their income to purchase a home. That is a massive mortgage. In the old rule of thumb, 3 times income was the normal. And when houses were 3 times income, you could buy a house on a single income. One of the husband or the wife could stay home with the kids while they're young. You can actually raise your own children. You don't have to rely on childcare. You can afford to go on a holiday and buy a new car. That was a normal way of life in Australia. Now you need a double income household, and even then, you're going to struggle to buy a house at all. In Sydney, I think the multiple is somewhere between 12 and 13 times income. So that's completely unaffordable, except for the absolute elite. The other factor that's driving our house prices is migration levels at record numbers and continuing that way. And we're not talking about highly skilled, highly trained migrants that are bringing cash with them. We're talking about a lot of these visas that are granted are for students with no money. So we have a massive university sector, which is really powerful. They take in a lot of foreign students. But what that mostly does is increases the demand on housing, which means that rents and houses are largely unaffordable for most Australians now, which is really sad, because Australia is a nation that is blessed with almost anything you could ever want. If you wanted to choose a country to settle, you would pick Australia. We have iron ore, we have uranium, we have gas, we have amazing farmland. We have it all. But unfortunately, we've had it too good for too long. Government's been really inefficient. It's got enormous. And the Australian people have also got used to government fixing their problems. So when something goes wrong, we throw our hands up and say, hey, government, bail us out or fix it. And they borrow a bit more money, they push the public debt up, and they devalue our currency in the process. It's a vicious cycle, which is yet to end. It's still continuing.
Do you think? I mean, my mind was boggled when I first learned about many years ago about the housing in Australia. Like for a middle-sized home that in the U.S. you might get, or Europe, is like what, $1 million or something in Australia, and
Yep.
I can't fathom that. I got lucky. I mean, I was able to pay my little home off here in Mexico, which is how it should be. My wife isn't working, but now, as you say, in the West, increasingly both have to work. Peter Schiff has explored this further. I had him once on the podcast where, back in the 50s, just the husband can work, wife stays at home, grow a family, buy a car, buy a house, no debt. And over the years, it's become where both the husband and wife are working just to maintain the credit. So you don't even have savings, and then on top of that, you have to get your kids working. That was my my parents in the U.S. put me to work at age 15 legally, which you could in the U.S. with parents' permission. And I was working full time as a high school student and going to high school full time, and that just transitioned to university. And so you got to have both parents working plus the kids working just to stay above water. Your thoughts on the war front? I probably think that Senator Babet maybe doesn't focus as much on the foreign policy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I had on Australian Army veteran not long ago, Cameron Leckie, where we discussed this more in depth. And from what I've been reading, Australia and New Zealand foreign policy has become one with U.S. foreign policy. And you've got this talk about war with China. And do you have any thought on World War III?
Yeah, you're right. Senator Babet doesn't focus heavily on this because we can't have a huge impact in this space, obviously, and we try and focus where we can. But look, my default position is that there is no such thing as a good war. In all wars, innocent people die, and that is a really bad thing. We have murmurs of war all over the world, don't we? You've got Europe, you've got the Middle East, you've got Asia. But the reality is for Australia that we have chosen our friends, and we lie with America and the UK through the AUKUS deal especially. We're looking at nuclear-powered submarines and those sorts of things, because the truth is that our defence force is nowhere near as strong as it needs to be. And the best form of defence militarily is a really strong military of your own. You want to appear big and powerful so that therefore no one wants to take you on, right? And I think that's the strategy. Australia doesn't have much of another option other than working with the US, sadly, because we're a small nation. We have quite a small defence force, really, and not a huge amount of resource that's invested in defence. We invest all sorts of money in all sorts of programs, especially something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but so in Australia, we have Medicare, which is quite a good system in terms of healthcare. But now we have something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which has only been around for, I think, around a decade or a touch under, it's already cost more per year than Medicare. And Medicare for a developed nation is a luxury. We now have something bigger than that, which is going to grow, I think, about 3 more times in size over the next decade as well. So we waste a lot of money on all sorts of things. And this disability insurance scheme is being used to pay for hookers, for people with disabilities, for overseas trips, all sorts of ridiculousness. So I would prefer to see that money thrown into defense personally, because, well, if you can't defend your nation, you won't have a nation eventually, will you? So, the allocation of resources is pretty average in Australia. And I think if we want to maintain the nation that we have and our sovereignty, we need to throw the money into defense more so than these frivolous other actions.
We're already seeing in the West, in places like UK, I mean, no more money for pensions. I think Social Security is slated to run out in the 2030s in the US, and UK is already trying to cut down pension benefits. And in Canada, I mean, it's really going the way of the, like, Soylent Green, the movie, where they're promoting euthanasia basically and lowering the requirements, age 18, and hey, you having a bad day? Sign right up and we'll put you out of your misery. Beyond Australia, any thoughts on the state of the world or the state of freedom beyond Australia? My biggest concern is just basically this trend across the West. I interviewed some years back Gregory Copley, Australian, of the International Strategic Studies Association, and I respect his views a lot. He's an older, very experienced person, an analyst who's dealt with governments, and he says that, and he's a deep student of an author of books on history, and he says that the age of democracy is over. We may return to it in a future cycle, but it's basically we're in an age of authoritarianism, and across the West, you're just seeing this trend currently moving forward. And any thoughts there?
Yeah, socialism is attractive to people, isn't it? Because there's a very short-term win there for them, but they don't comprehend the long-term damage that it does. I think our generation and the generation under us has probably, in Australia anyway, had it too easy. Our parents had a good time. Economics were good. There wasn't a huge amount of pressure. There was still enough freedom. But if you really wind back and look at, the actions of government over the past 30, 40, 50 years, they never repeal any legislation. We now live in a nanny state, and what happens is layer upon layer upon layer of laws get applied, and it's incremental and it's slow and it's not obvious. But if someone popped up today from 1990 and tried to live in this world, they would be appalled by the number of rules that we live by. Like, I can't get out of bed without the state's permission. I can't build a wall in my house. I can't drive a car. I can't really do anything without the state authorizing it, right? Like, and it's happened slowly but steadily, and people tolerate that sort of change, don't they? Because they don't notice it. It's just an everyday part of life. But, they also don't understand how liberating it is to live in a world whereby you aren't fully controlled by the state. But I don't think the majority of people appreciate that at the moment. And, in Australia, it's probably 3% of people that really understand the gravity of how much we've surrendered. And most people are agnostic or ignorant of the change. It's going to take time. And I think the only way that we are going to really return to that love of freedom and liberty is by experiencing pain. And we haven't felt sufficient pain yet. I thought the pandemic would do it. It didn't. It wasn't enough. Once again, we had the vocal 3% stand up, and it was great because we built some amazing communities, and we are very connected now, which is amazing. The friendship groups moved, but we have really long-lasting bonds through that period now, those that got through it. Sadly, some didn't, but those that got through it have those bonds and that love of freedom. But I don't think until there is significant pain or a war or a depression or a serious recession that people will really understand how much it matters.
I was going to echo that same sentiment. I've heard other people, yourself now, say that in Australia, people didn't wake up. And so I think it's going to, it's human nature. It's been written about many times in history. What did Orwell say? People aren't going to wake up until they have the boot slamming in their face. But then it's too late. And speaking of freedom, I used to live in Mongolia in the Gobi Desert, and I'd never felt freer than that. I think it's got the lowest population density. So you're standing there in the desert, living in a yurt with camels and horses, and no government, nowhere, and it was just amazing. And I'd love to go back there. And Europe is another example. They're now deploying later this year or next year the EES entry-exit system and ETIAS. And so you're going to have to fill out, anyone who's not European will have to fill out, pay 10 euros, whatever, and fill out this social credit form and wait to be approved by the system to go to Europe. Whereas before, you just buy a ticket and you hop on a flight to Rome or whatever. And it's just that it's increasing this insane trend. Any other thoughts on what people can, whether out there in Victoria and Australia or around the world, from the experience that you've had, that you've seen with Senator Babet and others, what are some things that people can do where they are to push back against this tide of tyranny?
It's not all one-way traffic. We are having a few little wins in the other direction. So last year we had a referendum in this country for a voice to Parliament, which was an Indigenous voice, which would have special powers to talk to government and be consulted on all legislation. We were turning back the history books to, a couple hundred years ago when the Western people settled in Australia and developed the nation into the wonderful nation it is now. And we're going to give special powers to a certain race class in Australia to inform government. And that went to a referendum, and every single state and territory in Australia voted it down, apart from one, which is called the Australian Capital Territory, which is where our capital city is, Canberra, where all the bureaucrats live for federal parliament. So I think that's the perfect example of the Australian people aren't racist. We don't want to see ourselves defined by race. We don't believe in special privileges. We believe that everyone should be treated the same. And we voted that way with one exception, those that work in federal parliament. So, it's not all is lost. The people do see common sense every now and then. And I think as government goes too far and as the cultural warriors go far too far, not even being able to define gender anymore, I think that is our opportunity to wake a few people up and get them moving and get them walking in the opposite direction. And I do think it is happening slowly, nowhere near fast enough, but and there are an awful lot of people who agree with what you and I say, and behind the scenes they say, "Oh, I love your work," but they never speak up. And sadly, those people are probably worse than those that are pushing the agenda because they are allowing it to happen. So I think it's on us to call that out as well. The Bible calls it sort of iron sharpening iron. You've got to convict a brother and make sure that they do step up and they do fight with you, because if people don't step up en masse, we will continue to see our culture destroyed. And that's happening not just through migration, it's actually happening through shaming our people over our past. We're often shaming our own citizens over actions that were taken by people hundreds of years ago that they have no control over and did not do. So, we've got to call that out and say, no, I've never committed those crimes. It's not me. Let's live today and treat people on their merit. But yeah, there is some hope, I believe, that we can fight back, but we've just got to speak up at every opportunity we get. Far too often are we quiet, and far too often do we sit quietly through things that are not right. Just speak up or walk out. Vote with your feet.
Yeah, and as you described the situation, this is part of the fun of participating in this struggle, this eternal struggle of good versus evil. So there's that challenge, and every generation is faced with this. It never ends, until it one day in the future it will end, for sure. But I was going to also say that what you mentioned has also been on my mind for many, many years. That I call it cowardice. Cowardice, where people will not speak out. Everyone is in a different situation, but I'd been willing. I didn't have the part. I didn't have the opportunity to experience losing my job over the past few years. But if I did, I wouldn't have thought twice about saying, I'm not doing this, fire me, or whatever. And I thought I'd just share this. Just yesterday, I was at the supermarket when we ran into a family friend here in Mexico. And I think this is just an example that this person's sibling, middle-aged person, died of a heart attack. And now this person, he's the brother, almost had a heart attack. And that person told me that I was right. We talked in 2020, and they asked me about the medical countermeasures, right, of the 2020s. I just speak in code here. And I said, whatever you do, do not take them. And I never knew what happened. And they told me now that they had taken 2, and then they have this they had like a heart issue. And so this is that courage, being able to stand against the crowd and all this intense pressure and say, no, I'm not taking it. And look at the fallout now. People are literally dying. And for me, this is democide. For the longest time, I've talked about R.J. Rummel, who coined that phrase, the historian, in his book, Death by Government. Our governments have literally been trying to exterminate us. It's absolutely insane. And so if you have, Michael, any final thought, and then if you want to tell us the best places that we can follow your work, projects, Senator Babet, and all that.
Excess mortality, you touch on that. Australia is probably the perfect example. So, a number of deaths jumped significantly in 2021, 22. But the sad reality is the total number of deaths has continued to run at that excess ever since. It hasn't ended. The most recent numbers that came out confirm that again. Up to June, we have more deaths this year than in 2023. And 2023 was very similar to 2022, and 2022 was like 20,000 more deaths than 2021. So, and our population's only been growing by about 1% a year on average. So you can't explain that by population growth. People are dying en masse, and one of the most alarming details of that, which has not yet been explained or properly looked into, is the fact that young women aged 0 to 44 continue to die in a large excess, but young men are not. And that's something that's really alarming to me. Every time I look at the figures, it's what is killing our young women. I can't confirm for sure because we don't have the death certificates or the specific details. The data is really, it's limited, right? It can't give us an answer. We can have some hypothesis, which I'm sure you would share a couple of hypotheses that I have. But we can't confirm. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that our authorities pretty much say there's nothing to see here. And that is the most alarming thing. And that's something that I and Senator Babet's team will continue to pursue until we're blue in the face, because it's life and death. And it's real. And we're not going to let them hide it. We had a public inquiry into it, which we got up, but that was whitewashed. Sadly, it was really suppressed and didn't really investigate like it was supposed to. But that's one example of the work that we'll keep doing. I'm really thankful for the time to talk to you today. I think jump on YouTube, on X, Facebook, Instagram, look up Senator Babet's page or myself, Michael Arbon. You'll see our content there. But I'm really lucky to do the job that I do, to work for someone who's willing to risk everything. And he cops a massive amount of personal abuse for challenging the narrative. But we sleep well at night, man, because we know we can't change the world. But we know that, by speaking the truth whenever we possibly can, that we might impact someone. And we absolutely do. So, you do that every day. You sleep well at night knowing that you're trying, but with the understanding that one person can't change the world, but you might inspire a few others to come along. Yeah.
That's definitely this. Well, first, you're doing what is right, regardless of what you think the impact might be. But then other people will learn from your example. And we just have to increase that percentage from what you said, 3% to 4 to 5 to 10 to 15. Yeah. And then we'll be getting somewhere. Well, keep up the great work out there, Michael. The links are in the description. Thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you very much. Keep up the great work, man.